Hello, hello. Welcome back to Young Heretics for episode 3. This is the show that brings you Western culture without the culture wars, where we shrug off identity politics and radical critical theory and all that nonsense and just get down to what makes the West great. This is an exciting episode. I'm really excited to do this episode because it's our first guest. We have an honorary heretic. We're going to have guests from time to time on this show. I will still be doing your classic lovable Spencer Klavan monologues, but we will also have from time to time experts in other areas, because obviously there's a vast amount of stuff in Western literature and history that I am not an expert in at all. And so we're going to call in all sorts of other experts from around town. Our first honorary heretic is, I'm really excited about this, it is Barry Strauss, who is many things. He's a professor of Roman history, but he also writes more generally about ancient history and Roman history in books that I really love, and you should definitely check them out if you haven't checked them out yet. His latest one is called 10 Caesars. It's really excellent. And one of the things that Barry does really well that is actually quite hard to do is he makes ancient history as exciting as it actually is. The funny thing about this stuff is there's all of this just blood and gore and sex and intrigue that goes on in the ancient world, and for some, and because it can be hard to really get down at the facts of what happens, it can be difficult then to kind of pull out of all of those many different ancient sources, pull out an exciting but true narrative that really sort of gets at what's so cool about all of these stories. Barry is great at that, and he's also great at applying some of the lessons that he derives, especially about leadership and war and statesmanship from ancient history and applying them to kind of our modern situation today. So I'm very excited to talk to Barry. He's got 10 Caesars is out. He's also got a podcast, Antiquitas, which you should totally check out and rate and review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. But today he's giving us a sneak peek at his newest book, which is about, again, one of the, I think, coolest episodes from ancient history. It's got everything. It's got sex, it's got intrigue, it's got politics, it's got backstabbing and betrayal, the Battle of Actium, and leading up, all the sort of crazy Roman history leading up to the Battle of Actium, which many people think is sort of the last battle of the Roman Republic that then turns over into the first battle of the Roman Empire. So this takes place in the late 30s BC, 32 to 31 BC. And we're dealing here with a sort of seismic shift, a change from republican to imperial politics in Rome. And this is the battle where it all goes down. Barry, so glad to have you here as an honorary heretic.
Well, thank you, Spencer. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I'm delighted to be an honorary heretic. I've always thought of myself as a heretic.
Tremendous.
The only correction I'll make is that in theory, I'm a professor of Greek history, so I'm a double heretic because I write about Roman history.
Oh my gosh, you've committed the terrible sin of transgression, of departmental transgression.
Departmental transgression. But,
oh my gosh.
My colleagues are wonderfully supportive, and
that's good.
I go back and forth between Greece and Rome. And it's only appropriate for this because the Battle of Actium, a Roman history battle, took place in Greece.
True. Yeah, no, that's excellent. Can we just, for listeners may not be familiar actually with Actium, they may be a little bit more familiar with Antony and Cleopatra, who are in some ways the stars.
They are the stars.
Yeah. Could you just back up for us and tell us sort of what's going on in Rome at this time and how we get to this battle?
Absolutely. So I would say it's all about Caesar. Julius Caesar casts a shadow over the whole thing. He is the great wonderful and evil genius who brings the Roman Republic to its knees, who becomes Rome's first dictator for life after winning a very bloody civil war and conquering the entire empire. And he is immediately rewarded by being assassinated on the Ides of March, perhaps the most famous assassination in history. Right. And the Romans then quarrel over Caesar's inheritance. On the one hand, are the people who assassinated him, famously led by Brutus and Cassius. On the other hand, there are two men quarreling over Caesar's mantle. Caesar's chief surviving military lieutenant Marcus Antonius, who we know of as Mark Antony,
Mhm.
and Caesar's grand nephew, who's an 18-year-old kid at the time, but who, to many people's surprise, is adopted posthumously in Caesar's will and who inherits most of Caesar's estate. He is a man named Gaius Octavius, whose claim to fame is that his mother's mother is Caesar's sister, or was Caesar's sister, named Julia. And Caesar took young Gaius Octavius under his wing because he had no Roman son of his own. He had a daughter who had died, unfortunately. When he dies, his will is read, and lo and behold, Gaius Octavius is his heir. Octavius changes his name. He says, "Call me Caesar. I'm now Gaius Julius Caesar." And most Romans laugh at this. But it turns out that the kid is a Machiavellian genius. He has this astonishing talent, and he sat at Caesar's knees, and so he's learned a lot about how you run, how you do this, how you become a dictator. And he says, "I want to have everything Caesar had." He has to fight against Mark Antony, who sees himself. Mark Antony's a man in the prime of life, 40-ish, sees himself as Caesar's heir. He's been a winning general. And the two of them fight at first, and Octavian, through his allies, actually defeats Antony, but Antony recoups and gets a whole lot of legions on his side, and the two guys end up joining forces, and they bring in a third loyalist of Caesar, a man named Lepidus, and the three of them decide.
This is the third wheel, right, of the whole
third
situation.
wheel. Yes, the third wheel.
Okay.
And the three of them decide they are going to take over the Roman government. They march on Rome, and they force the Senate. On my birthday, on the 27th of November, a memorable day in the year 43 BC, they decide that the Senate passes a law saying that they are now, the three of them are basically the Roman government. And their first order of business is to make war on Brutus and Cassius, who are in the east and who have been raising taxes and raising an army to fight them. And they fight a battle in northeastern Greece at a place called Philippi, and 42 BC, and they defeat first Cassius and then Brutus in 2 separate days. Antony is the hero of that battle. Octavian got sick and spent much of it in his tent or hiding from the enemy. And Antony is the great hero afterwards. And the two of them decide they're roughly going to divide the world. Roughly going to divide the world with Octavian taking over Italy and most of the West, Lepidus getting North Africa, and Antony focusing on the East. And Antony goes to Athens.
So at this point, and people might be interested in this as a potential analog to our present situation. At this point, the Senate has basically voted its own power away. Is that right? They've basically just handed the whole thing over to these three.
They've handed much of their power away. They still have some, but they've had to turn it away. And I should say that it's not a pretty picture. Right. I left out one important fact. When Antony and Octavian and Lepidus make their deal, they actually meet on an island. They meet on an island near Bologna. They decide to launch a purge to threaten some of the wealthiest people in Rome who might be opponents. Your money or your life. Either give us everything we have or you'll kill you. Most of them go into exile and save their lives. Some of them are killed. The most famous one who is executed is one of the most famous people from the ancient world, Cicero. Marcus Tullius Cicero. Cicero had helped Octavian on his way up. He'd been a staunch opponent of Antony, and Octavian betrays Cicero. He turns him over to Antony, lets Antony kill him. So this purge really has a lot to do with the Senate giving up its power. So these two heirs of Caesar, you've got Octavian in Italy, who wants to settle the veteran troops and establish his power in Italy. And you've got Antony in the East, who wants to carry out Caesar's unfinished business of making war on the last empire left standing in the ancient world. That's the Parthian Empire, roughly the equivalent of today's Iran and Iraq. So it doesn't go so well for Octavian. First of all, in the in Italy, his attempt to settle the veterans meets resistance from the people who are going to be dispossessed by their land.
Mm-hmm.
And Antony's brother, and if you can believe it, his wife, a tough lady named Fulvia, they lead a rebellion against Octavian. And Antony has plausible deniability. I have nothing to do with this. It's just my brother and my wife. It's an ugly war.
How plausible is that deniability to us? I mean, do we think he's fomenting this, or are they genuinely up in their own?
It's hard to say, really hard to say. I personally think he's in on it, but
Sure.
Hard to say.
Okay.
Anyhow, they lose. The brother and the wife lose. Octavian wins. He allows the brother and the wife to escape. And then he has another problem. His other problem is that Sicily and many of the islands of the central Mediterranean have been taken over by the son of Pompey. Mm-hmm. Pompey the Great was Caesar's opponent. He has one son left, Sextus Pompey, who turns out to be a brilliant admiral and puts together a fleet in which many of the refugees from the purge in Italy have fled to Sicily under his protection, and he now cuts off the grain supplies from Italy to Rome. Antony's in the east, and he has to make a choice. Am I going to support Octavian, or am I going to support Sextus to get rid of Octavian? And it's a moment of decision, and Octavian has an inducement for Antony to support him, and that is Octavia, his sister.
It's pretty good,
pretty good inducement. Who just happens to be a widow. Her husband dies conveniently, and Antony becomes a widower because his wife Fulvia also dies conveniently. And so in 40 BC, so 4 years after the Ides of March, the two of them marry, and there is joy in Rome that Antony and Octavian, who calls himself Caesar, are now buddies, and they are brothers-in-law, and there's going to be a son born to cement the new dynasty.
It must have been a tremendous relief that these two kind of titans that have been potentially clashing, tearing the city apart are now. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Got it. There was, and it's the background for Virgil writing the fourth epilogue, which sees a golden age coming from a child. Well, a child is born, but it turns out to be a girl. Actually, it turns out to be two girls.
Right.
But that's not the biggest woman problem that they have. The biggest woman problem that they have is named Cleopatra. So Cleopatra is one of the most brilliant, fascinating, and ambitious people of the ancient world. And I'd say one of the most brilliant, fascinating women in history.
Okay, so now I just have to interrupt you real quick, because this is one of the just most titanic moments in I think all really of world history, and certainly of Roman history. It gets a very, very famous, one of Shakespeare's most famous monologues in his play about Antony and Cleopatra. Obviously not everything, we'll get to this, I'm sure, not everything in Antony and Cleopatra is historically true, but Shakespeare does, as he so often does a tremendous job just sort of vivifying this picture of Cleopatra on her barge coming to seduce Antony. I have my edition here, which I'll hold up for people who are watching. This is, if you're just listening, this is the Folger Shakespeare, Antony and Cleopatra. And this is Act 2, Scene 2, the report from Enobarbus about how Cleopatra looked on her barge trying to seduce Antony. He says, the barge she sat in like a burnished throne burned on the water. The poop was beaten gold. The poop is the part of the ship, by the way, so don't giggle. The poop was beaten gold. You can giggle if you want. Purple the sails, and so perfumed that the winds were lovesick with them. The oars were silver, which to the tune of flutes kept stroke, and made the water which they beat to follow faster, as amorous of their strokes, as if the water itself was enamored of Cleopatra. For her own person, it beggared all description. She did lie in her pavilion, cloth of gold, of tissue o'er-picturing that Venus where we see the fancy outwork nature. On each side her stood pretty dimpled boys. On each side of her stood pretty dimpled boys, like smiling cupids, with diverse colored fans, whose wind did seem to glow the delicate cheeks which they did cool, and what they undid did. All right, I just had to break in and read that because that text is so good and you gave me such a good opening to do it. But Barry, back to you for the actual history of this whole thing.
Okay, so she has fought her way. She's a royal princess of Egypt, the last independent kingdom in the Mediterranean that the Romans haven't gobbled up. She's fought her way to the throne, becoming the queen regnant. She's done it partly by getting very powerful protection. At the age of 21, she became the mistress of Julius Caesar. Mm-hmm. And she had made the very smart move of getting pregnant and giving birth to his son.
Always an excellent, nice work if you can get it. An excellent
nice
choice.
Work if you can get it. His name is Ptolemy the 15th Caesar. And in Alexandria, a city known for a fast-talking wisecrackers, they call him Little Caesar, in Greek, Caesarion.
Yep.
Caesar never acknowledges paternity, but he never denies it either. And the fact that he allows Cleopatra to come to Rome and ensconces her in his villa across the Tiber and puts up a statue of her in his temple to the founder of his dynasty, the goddess Venus, suggests he doesn't really mind and is happy to be thought of as the father of the future king of Egypt. Romans not too happy about this. So Caesar dies. Cleopatra's left high and dry until she finds new protection. Antony. She seduces Antony in the fabulous scene in Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. She meets him in a stunning barge, which sails up the river in the city of Tarsus, in southern Turkey. And there she and Antony become allies and lovers. This is a year before Antony marries Octavia.
Yeah, right.
The very fertile Cleopatra gets pregnant again. And this time she outdoes the first time. She has twins, if you can believe it. A boy.
It's really impressive. I mean, how she managed it is kind of hard to imagine.
Yeah, she's incredible. A boy and a girl.
Yeah.
And Antony, he's married to Octavia. He's living with her in Athens. But his big goal, his eyes on the prize of making war on the Parthian Empire. If you believe the maximalist approach, he wanted to conquer the whole thing. A much more reasonable interpretation, in my view, is that he wanted to gobble off a piece of it, roughly what is today northwestern Iran, and get the Parthians to give back the legionary eagles and legionary standards that they had captured when they had defeated another Roman general, Crassus, in a famous Roman defeat about 15, 20 years earlier. So that's the plan. And Cleopatra is his paymaster. Cleopatra is sitting on the treasury of the wealthiest country in the world, Egypt.
Sure. Yeah.
And she supports him. But also, the other plan is that Antony's job is to create Rome's eastern frontier. What Rome needs in the east is they need a series of friendly kings and client states in a line going from what is now the Black Sea coast of Turkey all the way down to Egypt. And Antony turns out to be a totally brilliant statesman and diplomat. He sets it up with a series of kinglets going all from the Black Sea to Cleopatra in Egypt. One of these kings is one of the most infamous kings in history, King Herod. Who Antony sets up as the king of Judea. Herod and Cleopatra, by the way, hate each other's guts. It's like
I did not know that. I did not know
diva. It's like the diva and the devo. They hate each other.
Gosh, that's amazing.
And Cleopatra wants nothing more than to let her just destroy Herod, but Antony doesn't let her do it. He does, however, let her take over some other countries to add to her portfolio, making Egypt stronger than it has been in 200 years.
Right.
And they have another kid, by the way. So now have two sons and a daughter. So
this is something I hadn't really grokked this. I mean, I suppose I knew it in the back of my mind, but the fact that Cleopatra is not only a sort of power source, but also a sugar mama, basically, right? I mean, she's got this incredible wealth behind her. So how does this all fall apart? I mean, it all sounds like it's going great, and then what happens to make it?
What happens? A couple of things happen. So first of all, Octavian makes war on Sextus Pompey in the west, and Octavian is quite terrible at naval battles. However, his right-hand man and loyalist, Marcus Agrippa, who is a brilliant land commander, turns himself into a brilliant naval commander.
Right.
And it's a long story, which you can't go into today. You'll want to read my book to find out about it. But he manages to defeat Sextus Pompey and drive him into exile. So suddenly Octavian is now sitting on this great navy. That's the first thing that happens. The second thing that happens is that Antony launches his campaign to make war on the Parthians, and it doesn't go all that well. It turns into a defeat. I should say, by the way, that 99% of our sources for all this, our written sources, are propaganda from the point of view of the winners. So we don't really have Antony and Cleopatra's story all that well. The propaganda
is for people that might want to go back to these sources. Who are sort of our major sources for this?
So our major source is a great source. It's Plutarch's Life of Antony. Plutarch, of course, wrote the parallel lives of the noble Grecians and Romans. And as luck would have it, it's generally thought that his life of Antony is absolutely his best life. It's really terrific. Later on inspires the poet Cavafy, who writes fantastic poetry from it. But it's propaganda. And another source, not such a great writer, is the Roman historian Cassius Dio. Each of these guys lived centuries or more later. He's got a lot of information about it. And there are little bits and pieces. The poet Horace has some terrific stuff about this. And it even makes a cameo in the Aeneid, in Virgil's Aeneid. Luckily for me as a historian, there's a lot of material evidence, especially coins. The coins are amazing for what they tell us about this. And there's been some really stupendous scholarship done on this. You're really standing on the shoulders of giants if you're writing about this, about this subject. So anyhow, to make a long story short, Antony loses in against Parthia, but then he comes back and manages to recoup. He conquers Armenia and he makes an alliance with a power in the east that he's going to be able to leverage to start a new war against Parthia. At this point, Octavian says, I don't think so. I don't trust you and Cleopatra one bit. I'm going to strike while the iron is hot. Octavian's also won a little war in roughly what is nowadays Croatia, increases his power, and he then declares war on Cleopatra, one of the greatest PR moves in history. He's too shrewd to declare war on Antony, a fellow Roman. Can't do it because Octavian, has promised no more civil wars.
Oh, that's genius. Yeah. Okay.
But he declares war on Cleopatra, who he says is an evil seductress who has brought a once great Roman to his knees. Now, from the Roman point of view, so Antony and Cleopatra, they're not chopped liver. They're smart. They've been putting together a fleet to protect themselves for years, and it's now ready to roll. From the Roman point of view, Antony now does a very stupid thing. He divorces Octavia, which he didn't really need to do. But from the Eastern point of view, it's not a dumb move. Because from the Eastern point of view, Antony and Cleopatra are selling themselves to the Eastern Mediterranean as the great resistance against the evil Roman Empire. Cleopatra, as the queen of Egypt, is Pharaoh, and she's also a god, a goddess. She is Isis. Antony, for years, has been calling himself basically the new Dionysus. We think of Dionysus as basically this frat boy who just wants to drink. But in the ancient world, Dionysus was the god who conquered Asia. He was the god of Alexander the Great. He's a great military figure. And now, by divorcing Octavia, Antony and Cleopatra can say, Dionysus and Isis are united. Dionysus is also conveniently the Egyptian god Osiris, and Isis is also conveniently the goddess Aphrodite or Venus. The gods are united in this holy war against the Romans. Never mind the fact that Antony is a Roman. We'll airbrush that out. But led by Cleopatra. So it is a bad propaganda move in Rome, but a brilliant propaganda move in the East. And now the scene switches to Greece, where Antony and Cleopatra are planning their campaign. they are threatening to invade Italy, which they don't do right away. They occupy the west coast of Greece, and they're threatening to invade Italy. They're actually fighting on two tracks. On the one track, they've got this great navy and army with them now. On the other track, they're engaging in political and information warfare because they know that Octavian is not all that popular in Italy, that many Romans hate him. Many senators flee Italy and they go to Antony. They'd rather be him. And if I had time, I could talk more about the political maneuverings and the evidence that there's a lot of opposition in Antony to Octavian in Italy. So Antony and Cleopatra are playing a waiting game. They're threatening to invade Italy. They're willing to invade Italy, maybe. We're not 100% sure. And they're hoping that Octavian's coalition will crack. It's now 32 BC. We're at the beginning of the campaign season. It's March. And Antony and Cleopatra are waiting for the enemy to make their move. It's unclear whether they're waiting for the enemy to make the move or whether they're going to gather their forces and invade Italy. They're expecting the enemy to cross the Adriatic, if he comes, in the north, leaving from Brindisi and crossing to what's now Albania near the Greek island of Corcyra.
Sure.
When suddenly, out of the blue, the enemy takes a risk that they never expected. They attack in the south. They attack in the southwestern Peloponnesus. And they come in the rear and they cut off Antony and Cleopatra's supply lines. And this, led by Agrippa, is now a happy hunting expedition against the navy, against the Roman navy, against Antony and Cleopatra's navy in the waters of Greece. And they knock off our flotilla after flotilla. And suddenly, Octavian comes from the north, from Brundisium and Tarentum. He comes with the bulk of the Roman fleet, and he lands in the north.
All right.
Antony and Cleopatra have their navy at a place called Actium, a small place that's the entrance to the Gulf of Ambracia, a protected gulf, a good place to have your fleet. Octavian and Agrippa join up, and they set up camp north of there. And Antony and Cleopatra hurry there, and they hope with their army that they can defeat Octavian and drive him out. But they are unable to do so. The other problem is they can no longer feed their men. Agrippa's war on Antony's supply lines has been so effective that his men are starving. They're also suffering from disease. And so we're now in the summer of 32 BC, and Antony and Cleopatra realize they have no choice except to escape, to fight a breakout battle. And that is what we know as the Battle of Actium, September 32 BC. It's a success. Antony and Cleopatra managed to break out. They managed to escape. Shakespeare tells a story that comes from Plutarch about Cleopatra betraying Antony, but that's not really what happened. There was a plan for the two of them to escape. That's the good news. The bad news is they've no longer got an army. They've no longer got an army because the army tries to escape overland, but those guys are hungry and they are sick. And Octavian makes them an offer they can't refuse. Actually, it's not really an offer that they can't refuse. He says, I come in peace. I forgive you all. Why don't you join me and I'll pay you? And they say, sounds good to me.
I can imagine that looks pretty attractive at that point.
The generals escape to Antony, but the soldiers join Octavian. And now Octavian slowly closes the noose. It's shocking. It's a shocking result, and by no means what was expected. And you're going to have to read my book where I explain in great detail how on earth they pulled off the stunning, risky coup of destroying Antony's supply lines, which to me is amazing part of the story.
I could sit and listen to you tell this story basically for the next hour and a half, but I am going to have to read your book because we're running out of time. I would like to hear from you just a little bit, about why in this moment, you're an incredibly learned guy. You've got a lot of subjects. Antiquity is a big place. There's a lot to talk about. Why this book now? Why Actium now?
Well, for one thing, it's a book about the clash between East and West, and which is certainly a subject that's very much on our minds. For another thing, it's a book about how you win wars. And, we are living in a period that's been defined as a period of hybrid warfare, in which information warfare, Trojan horses, financial warfare, economic warfare are every bit as important as military campaigns. And furthermore, I'm just going to do it that. And I think this campaign is just kind of just an amazing example of that. So
wow,
I think it's
fascinating.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad you think so.
No, yeah, I'm really looking forward to the book, truly. And folks, if you have not, as I said, if you haven't checked out Barry's previous work, you should go check out 10 Caesars and also Antiquitas, where you can hear him tell more stories like this, wherever you get your podcasts. Barry, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to hear
Thank you, Spencer. The pleasure's been mine. Thank you for having me.
Well, that was awesome. It was great to have our first guest on Young Heretics. That's honorary heretic Barry Strauss, talking about the Battle of Actium, which takes place between 32 and 31 BC, since dates go backwards in BC, as you all know, I'm sure. We are going to switch now to the mailbag, which, as we said, is a weekly segment. I'm going to take a few questions that come in over Twitter. If you want to ask a mailbag question, you are more than welcome to. What you do is you tweet that question at me, at Spencer Klavan, and include hashtag Young Heretics in there. So I've got two questions here. The first is one that came to me over Twitter. Somebody was asking me, how can I get my kids interested in Western civilization? I want to introduce them to Western culture. I want them to have a sort of foothold, but they're very young. I think 2, 4, and 6, and I just want something that I can read to them that they'll enjoy and understand. And this is my answer is going to maybe seem obvious, or it'll either seem weird or it'll seem obvious, depending. I think you should read them the Bible, and I don't think that just because I'm a Christian. You don't actually have to be a Christian. I've said this on my previous episode, right? You don't have to be a Christian to know the Bible and to need to know the Bible, really, in order to be well educated. People have said about the Bible that it's deep enough for an elephant to drown in and shallow enough for a child to play in. And that really is true, especially some of the histories are just so rip-roaring fun. And you get a good sort of simple translation like the New Revised Standard Version or something like that. Especially 1st and 2nd Kings and before that, 1st and 2nd Samuel, Book of Judges. Those are really great places to start. And that can get your kids, I think, interested in both in ancient history and in the Western canon more generally. Plus, it'll just be an education for them. I have one other question that I'm going to answer, and this one is actually a sort of semi-hostile question, I guess. We rolled out the first episode not too long ago, and mostly the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Thank you guys so much for giving us 5-star reviews and downloading all this stuff, and this has all been great. I got a few people emailing me in, and I kind of knew this was going to happen, who said, okay, so you say that you're dispensing with the culture wars, right? You're putting the culture wars outside. But in order to do that, you're telling all of these crazy, identity politicians. Well, they didn't say crazy. You're saying you're telling all of these people who believe in queer theory and believe in feminist theory and gender theory, you're telling them they're just dumb and you're ignoring them like they don't matter. Isn't that just participating in the culture wars in your own way? And I have a very succinct answer to this, which is, yep. Correct. Absolutely right. This is totally a culture war move, right? I mean, you can't avoid, there's no existing in a world where the culture wars don't exist. And it's absolutely a power move to just say, you know what? This is all dumb and I don't actually have to argue with you all the time. I can just, spend time enriching myself and others with this Western canon that you think is so racist and stupid and homophobic and bigoted. So yeah, 100%. You got me. It's true. It's a culture war move. It's a power move. And guess what? It's going to work. We will see you next week. It has been such a joy to bring you episode 3 of Young Heretics. Thank you so much to the Claremont Institute for your continuing support. Leave a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.